A recent NewsNation Decision Desk poll of over 1,000 voters found that moving into the midterm elections, 61% of voters are worried about President Biden's health. The poll also saw a growing focus on crime among voters. 62% still see inflation as the biggest issue in the country, but concern for crime was up 3% from June.
Additionally, 61% of voters think Biden should not run for re-election in 2024. More specifically, 30% of Democrats don't want Biden to run again, and 26% of Republicans don't want Trump to run. Political editor at NewsNation, Chris Stirewalt, is here to weigh in. Welcome, Chris.
Good to be with you guys.
So here's the reality of the situation. Enormous numbers of Democrats, of course, unsurprisingly, large quantities of Republicans don't want Biden to run again. But there is this issue of whether or not a replacement for Joe Biden in this kind of unprecedented way would damn the Democrats even more than his low poll numbers. What do you make of that tension?
Well, the thing is, normal people aren't paying attention to this kind of stuff. So when you look at a poll like this and you see who Democrats' other choices are, basically it's a name identification poll. I find very interesting here when you look at how do independent voters, because what we're really talking about, of course, always to win a general election means you're going to need to win the independents. When you look at independent voters with Biden, 63% of independents don't want Biden to run again. While Trump and Biden are about the same with their own party, Trump at 26, Biden at 30%, not wanting them to run. Trump does even worse with independents for a third candidacy. 65, almost 66% of independent voters said they didn't want Trump. When you start looking down the list of who else it might be, it's too early. And on the Democratic side, it happens in a strange space because Biden hasn't yet said that he's not going to run. I think there's a pretty decent chance that Biden will bow out of this in a time early enough to allow his party to sort itself out. We'll see how the Democrats do in midterms, and the Democrats' performance in midterms will have an effect on this. But I would not be at all surprised to see Biden step aside after not step aside, but say that he was not going to seek another term after midterms.
That's interesting. I mean, we're hearing that more and more, I think, from expert people like yourselves. I tended to think Biden would stick it out just because he has to deal with the problem that who is more popular in the party other than him, despite his sagging approval numbers. Now, he has had, it looks like he's having, I guess, a better week than he's had before. Some legislation got passed. Maybe the inflation, the economic situation might be kind of improving down the horizon. Obviously, we killed a terrorist, so there's that. Do you think, is it possible we've kind of, Biden's like low tide fortunes have been hit and you're going to see some rebounding as we approach the midterms?
Well, don't underestimate the political value, especially in the longer term of the killing of al-Zawahiri in Afghanistan. Biden had a bad foreign policy story to tell in Afghanistan, so this is significant because it helps him tell a better story there. Foreign policy doesn't drive midterm elections usually, though. The real driver, of course, here, as we see, inflation, even among Democrats, it is their top concern. Crime, on the crime front, something very interesting to me. So 48.3% of Democrats said it was very important to their congressional vote. 39% said it was somewhat. So that's 88.1% of Democrats said crime was important to their midterm vote. That's more than among independents and almost as high as Republicans. This crime issue, just like inflation, cuts across all these lines. And with Democrats, especially because they tend to be urban rather than rural, Republicans are the party of rural America. Democrats are the party of urban America. So you have a lot more Democrats living in cities where crime is prone to be a greater problem. So I think those kinds of considerations, I guess I'll put it this way. Biden is not considered a good president. He has a, what does he have? With Democrats, he has an 82% approval rating. That sounds high, but it really should be 90, right? The reason that Biden's overall approval rating is as low as it is because a significant number of Democrats don't approve of his handling of the job. Can I point you guys to why this election cycle is so weird?
Please.
Sure.
Okay, so in 2018 at this point, I looked it up before I talked to you. In 2018 at this point, Donald Trump was 11.4 points underwater in his job approval rating. So it was not therefore surprising, and this is, I just used 538, you do whatever you want, but it was not surprising therefore that Democrats would have a 7.9 point average advantage in the generic ballot. So you look at this poll, you see that Biden is further underwater in our poll than Trump was on average 4 years ago, 14.4. So that should be terrible, right? Because here's what we know about midterm elections. Basically, the generic ballot is going to track with presidential job approval. So if Biden's doing worse than Trump, therefore, what should we expect on the generic ballot? Well, guess what? It's the opposite. Democrats are ahead in the generic ballot in this poll by 1.2 points. That is not what we typically expect to see. If you would have told me without showing me the generic ballot number, I've got a president underwater by 14 and a half points. How's his party doing in midterms? They're going to get slaughtered. But instead, Democrats hold a statistically insignificant advantage, but an advantage nonetheless. And this tells us something about the cross forces that are at work here in this midterm cycle.
Well, that poll also found that voters' attitudes toward the economy are improving slightly, with 48% of voters saying they are worse off financially than they were a year ago, a 5% decrease from June. You know, is this part of what's affecting, you think, the Democrats' midterm chances not looking quite as bleak as you would have predicted? Or does it have something to do with the fact that Biden's low approval has to do with his age and people's concerns about his health, and less so a broader commentary on how the Democratic Party is doing?
Watching Joe Biden give a press conference is like watching an old dog on a freshly waxed kitchen floor trying to get across. The paws are going out from under. It's good. America holds its breath as Joe Biden attempts to communicate. And by the way, I should point out, that was true before he was very old, right? That was true. He has always been a mangler of syntax and easily distracted. Here's what I think is happening a little bit. So one of the questions in the poll was, are you going to be more motivated to vote as a result of recent Supreme Court decisions? And I found this particularly interesting. So you have, among Black and Hispanic voters, big increases as compared to white voters overall. And then among Democrats and Republicans, 70.6% of Democrats said that they would be more likely to vote in the midterms as a result of Supreme Court decisions. That's more than 20 points ahead of Republicans. I think what's going on here is, so midterms generally favor Republicans. When we talk about the generic ballot, if the generic ballot's tied, the Republicans are going to win the House because of Montana is a state. There are a lot of reasons that Republicans have, and it's to control the House. It's better to be a rural party, frankly, right? Because every state gets a representative and all of that stuff. So the Republicans have a structural advantage. They also have historically a turnout advantage. When Democrats were overwhelmingly the party of the working poor, it's hard to get poor voters to go out. It's hard to get voters with lower educational attainment levels to get out and vote. And historically, Republicans have had like a half a point or whatever, or 0.8 of a point advantage when it comes to midterm election turnout. What we see here is that these Supreme Court decisions and just general alarm about the Republican Party, general alarm about Donald Trump, general alarm about what is going on inside here's the shortest way I can say it. The Republicans are too weird. If the Republicans were more normal, then they would be thriving, right? It would be great. And they would be up the way that Democrats were 4 years ago. But the Republicans can't calm down and they can't sit still. And as a consequence, what they're doing is motivating Democratic voters. They're taking Democratic voters who might sit this out to punish Biden for not being liberal enough or progressive enough. Let's take Ohio as a great example. Tim Ryan is no progressive Democrat's dream date, right? He's a intentionally moderate and branding himself as much as he can as a centrist. If you're a Democrat who lives in Cleveland or Cincinnati or Columbus, and you think, I don't need to go vote for Tim Ryan, I don't care, two things are going to help you. Number one, the Supreme Court decision in Dobbs raises the value of every Senate seat for every Democrat. And then number two, J.D. Vance is really weird. And when you put those two things together, you get a strong motivator for Democratic. Now, this may change. This will change. I don't know in which direction it will change. But as a snapshot in time, this poll talks about a party that has strong structural disadvantages, but this weird wind blowing in its favor.
And the weirdness being somewhat connected to Trump himself, right? Who is not a figure that even a lot of people in the Republican Party wants to see run again, but who is certainly not sworn off running again, and is in fact giving many indications that he will run again. At the same time, you had the January 6th committee hearings going on. I think more. The fever sort of breaking a little bit, I've used that phrase on the Republican side, to realizing that Trump's continued presence or command of the Republican Party, it does not make good political sense for the Republican Party, but he is still such an important factor to it. He's not off stage enough for Republicans to be able to counter the narrative that Democrats have, that the Democrats obviously portraying him as still the guy. They want people scared of Trump at all times and going to the poll for that reason. And because Trump has not really exited the scene, those arguments can be persuasive. Do you think there's some of that?
As I am fond of saying, there's only one thing that Donald Trump, the mainstream press in the United States and the Democratic Party agree on, which is that every political news story should be about Donald Trump. And look at Missouri. Eric Greitens. So Missouri is a Republican state. It's not close. There's no reason that Missouri should be competitive in any way. But Missouri Republicans may nominate Eric Greitens, the super creepy, scandal-soaked former governor of the state who resigned in disgrace. That's the last person that you would want to nominate. But there is the fever that you talk about inside the Republican Party is the one that afflicts both parties, which is the iconoclastic desire to destroy what is present, right? To tear down what is present. Democrats are dissatisfied with Joe Biden. Cool. What do you got? What else you got? And the time for Democrats to have a discussion about that is after midterms, right? The time for what Democrats should do now is suck it up and support the home team and get it done and move on to the next thing and have the next fight. Republicans aren't even close to that point. They're not even close to being ready to grow up and talk about these kinds of things. You say Trump hasn't exited the stage. Trump is the commanding presence inside the Republican Party. And the biggest reason he has to keep running, or he can't give up the idea that he might run, is that he has to be a credible threat to these people. Because the moment that Donald Trump says, I'm not running, right? If Joe Biden said, I'm not running again, Democrats would throw him a parade. We salute you. Joe Biden's approval ratings would go up 15 points. I'm serious, if he said he wasn't going to run again, and he would have a successful last 2 years of his term, because he could quit sucking up to weirdos in his own party to try to hold on to his seat in the next presidential campaign. But the reality for Republicans is much starker, which is, as long as Donald Trump is a credible threat to be president again, the Kevin McCarthy's of the world and the other people who know better will not stand up to him. They're not going to do that because they're afraid of him, and they're afraid of the fact that he might be president again. And it was such a Mr. Toad's wild ride when he was president last time. They know that he will be there for vengeance, and they know that he will be there to hurt and destroy. So they're not going to make any moves. So that is a necessary perception for Donald Trump.
Trump delivered some of that characteristic roller coaster sort of attitude late yesterday, issuing an endorsement in that Missouri Senate Republican primary, just the first name Eric, because there's actually two, Eric Greitens and his competitor, Eric Schmidt, I believe, both same first name. So that was Trump's way of not endorsing in the race, I guess, or endorsing both those candidates in just the most chaotic kind of attention-seeing Trump style ever. But, well, we got to go. Chris Stirewalt, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Great to be with you guys.
We'll have more Rising right after this.